Muy buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos a este debate y posterior coloquio organizado por el think tank Gate Center, en el que durante aproximadamente una hora vamos a comprobar si el modelo de gobernanza impulsado en los últimos años por China y los países asiáticos en las últimas décadas y basado en la forja de conexiones entre grandes grupos empresariales y entre esos grandes grupos empresariales y los distintos gobiernos de los países asiáticos será válido para mantener el ritmo de crecimiento que se ha venido produciendo hasta ahora, y si finalmente veremos ese sorpaso de la economía china sobre la economía estadounidense. Y esto lo vamos a hacer de la mano de Simon Commander, economista, managing partner de Altura Partner, profesor del IE Business School y de la Universidad de Cambridge y autor del libro The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism. Un libro en el que se cuestiona precisamente si ese capitalismo oligárquico, como él mismo lo denomina, continúa siendo una ventaja y un motor de crecimiento, o si por el contrario podría convertirse en un talón de Aquiles para el crecimiento de la región. Welcome, Simon. First of all, excuse me for my English. Thank you very much for being here and shed light on the ASEAN world that, in my opinion, in the West economy seems to have put on the background sometimes. Como pueden comprobar, esta tarde Simon no viene solo, viene acompañado de otro primer espada, alguien conocido de sobra, conocido por todos ustedes, Miguel Sebastián, ministro de Industria, Comercio y Turismo entre 2008 y 2011 y asesor económico de Gate Center. Bienvenido, Miguel, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí y especialmente gracias porque bueno, pues, vienes además convaleciente todavía de una intervención, y además hoy tienes la agenda apretadísima, sabemos que tienes un compromiso de última hora. Y nos va a acompañar también esta tarde Águeda Parra, analista del entorno geopolítico y tecnológico de China, fundadora y editora de China Geotech y autora del libro China, las rutas de poder. Bienvenida, Águeda, y gracias. Y bueno, antes de dar paso al debate inicial, quería dar las gracias a Gate Center, que es un think tank, un espacio de reflexión cuya misión es analizar y estudiar las tendencias globales y emergentes tanto en la economía como en el ámbito social y tecnológico y cuál es su impacto en el orden político internacional. Gracias también a esta casa, a Thinking Heads y a su equipo de profesionales por cedernos su espacio y apadrinar esta iniciativa. Gracias también al equipo técnico de What the Fab y, por supuesto, gracias a ustedes por acompañarnos este penúltimo miércoles de mayo. Explicarles cómo se va a desarrollar el acto muy brevemente. Tendremos una primera parte de aproximadamente unos 15-20 minutos en la que Miguel Sebastián debatirá con nuestro protagonista, con Simon Commander, sobre el contenido y las tesis que se desarrollan en su último libro, en The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism, que además podrán ustedes adquirir una vez que finalice el acto, si así lo desean. Y una segunda parte de unos 40 minutos en la que abriremos una mesa coloquio en la que ya se incorporará nuestra invitada Águeda Parra y en la que relacionaremos el contenido de ese revelador libro con temas que están de plena actualidad, incluso algunos acontecidos este pasado fin de semana. Comentarles que el acto está siendo grabado para su posterior difusión en la web y redes sociales, así como en los medios de comunicación. Dicho esto, y ahora sí, ya no me entretengo más, cedo la palabra a Miguel Sebastián y a Simon Commander. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Gate por organizar este evento. And thank you very much, Simon, for being here. It's a pleasure, your collaboration with Gate. As Beatriz said, Gate is a think tank doing global analysis. We don't do Spanish economy or Spain's analysis, not even European, but global analysis. And of course, we are looking for a think tank that promotes dialogue and cooperation and multilateralism and so on. So this book for us is perfect because it offers a global view of a very interesting question, and it allows us to exchange ideas. As I told you before, this book I think is very useful. Very useful first because it's very nicely written. it's easy to read, but it has a lot of data, a lot of analysis done with a friendly way, not these sophisticated econometric models that nobody understands, but in a simple way, but with a lot of data, and it's also very brave, I think, in the punchline. Basically, the punchline is, well, we all agree that the 20th century was the century of the Western world, the US and Western Europe, Japan, in a way. But the general idea is that the 21st century belongs to Asia. And your point in this book basically is, well, who knows, maybe not, which I found it very attractive. Well, for me, the 21st century, as you know, belongs to Asia. But I think that you have very, very important points in this book that you raised, and I would like to comment. Basically, your point is that if you approach, like we do in the growth models that we teach at the university, growth from an institutional point of view, the role of institutions are very important for growth, not just the classical technological improvement, progress, capital accumulation, human capital accumulation, but also the institutional role is very important, and I agree. The question is how relevant is this institutional problem in Asia that you very, very clearly describe as to avoid this huge growth that everybody or most of the people forecast for Asia in this century. Actually, your point, which is true, is that Asia, by the way, your definition of Asia is not what we call Asia in general terms, but it's east of Pakistan, from Pakistan towards Japan. That's your definition of Asia. This is important because not the broad Asia we are used to. And your point is that these institutional factors, which are summarized in these very interesting links between these business groups and the political power, is going to hurt at some point of time, is going to hurt both innovation and productivity growth, no? Which is, in a sense, is a very relevant question. No? Now, as I told you sometime, this brings me the idea of a person that goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have to go on a diet because you need to take care of your health. Otherwise, it's going to be bad for you. And the guy doesn't pay attention to the doctor and says, well, I'm going to have breakfast with donuts. I'm going to drink wine whenever I want. I'm going to eat pizza. But then the guy goes to have a blood test, the analytics, and the analytics are excellent. And then the guy says, and the doctor says, what's going on here? This guy is not following my recommendation regarding institutions, but growth is very strong in Asia. Now, your point is wait and see. Wait and see. You're doing very well because you are young and everything is good for you, but wait till you get older. And this is going to, of course, going to have an effect on your health, in this case, on your growth. No? Now, I am a little bit skeptical about this wait and see. Why? Because the per capita income of Asia is so low, most of the countries, I mean the big countries, India, China, and so on, is so low that the convergence process is going to make this growth to be unstoppable. No? Maybe there will be not convergence in real per capita income. But in terms of GDP, there is no question that they will surpass the Western economy. They're almost doing it already, and that China will surpass the US in the next decade or so. No? And the second point is, to what extent are we sure that these institutions are so relevant in terms of productivity and innovation? They're probably very relevant in terms of quality of life, democracy, human rights. That I don't question. But in terms of productivity and economic growth, I really am not sure about this importance of these institutions. And in that sense, there is something that I would like to debate with you first. One temporary question, and then a cross-section. The time series question is, okay, maybe Asia is just 50 or even 100 years behind the US or the Western Europe economies. No? In what sense that the US and Western European economies, they also had this type of big business conglomerates, business groups with a lot of links with the political power. For example, well, it's not that I'm enjoying Succession in HBO, but for example, we know that the Rockefellers, the Ford, Hearst, and so on, the Carnegie families, they have a strong links in the early 20th century with the political power, and they have also this dynasty type of structure, and they impose some type of barriers to entry, but yet the US did fine. And they grew a lot, the US economy grew a lot, and they innovated. And then why cannot this happen also in Asia? Aren't we just watching what happened in the US, but 100 years later? That's one question. And the other question is, if we do cross-section, so the same point of time now of Asia with other regions of the world, are we really in Asia that bad? Compare in the institutional arrangements compared with, for example, Latin America, or not to say Africa. Probably Asia is doing much better, right? And actually, I found this index, so-called Elite Quality Index, the University of St. Gallen, that they did a ranking of countries' elites, because here the problem is not the elite and the general population. The question here is a good elite or bad elite. And these guys did a ranking of elite quality, and surprising, a lot of countries in the first 30 positions are from Asia. Singapore is number 1, Japan 18, South Korea 19, China 27, Thailand 30, and for example, Spain is 34. Italy is 40. So they are better in this elite ranking even than countries like Spain, Italy, Chile, or other countries that supposedly have very good or much better institutions. So my point here is, why do we think, or are we sure, positive, that this is going to be so binding as to claim that the 21st century is not going to belong to Asia?
Okay. Well, firstly, thanks to Beatriz, Gates Center, for inviting me and for our conversation debate. And I can see that although you may be lame physically after your operation, you're obviously not lame mentally. And that's the most important thing, because the points you raise are excellent and provocative. Perhaps I could just say a few things about the central arguments of the book, or restate them, and then bring them back to what you say, Miguel, so nicely. The book essentially argues that Asia is the great success of modern times. That's obvious to all. And as you rightly point out, it's got Asia to a point where, say, Chinese per capita incomes are a bit less than 20% of the US. South Korea is about half. India is in single digits, way down in single digits. So there's a lot of convergence, but convergence doesn't happen automatically. It's not a thing that you just get going and it takes off at whatever pace. It depends on a whole bunch of things. And in our book, what we argue is that the arrangements, institutional and the like, that have been formed have been highly useful indeed highly productive for, as it were, the stage of development, to borrow Rostow's phrase, that Asia has been going through. In other words, the accumulation of capital, human, physical, and the like, and the so-called, as we economists call it, extensive growth that has driven Asia onwards right now. But in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, in China, in Malaysia, in Thailand to some extent, this model is sort of run out of steam. You simply can't throw more capital at the problem. In fact, the Chinese probably have thrown far too much capital at the problem with declining returns. And in other places, essentially the labor force is finite. You can't simply rely on large transfers of people from the countryside to the town to drive it. So willy-nilly, as we say in English, these economies are going to have to shift towards innovation. And innovation can take many forms. And what we argue, and by the way, we're not saying that the institutional framework that we find grosso modo in the West, whatever that is, because the West is very heterogeneous. The US is not the same as Britain indeed, or France, let alone Spain. So there's a lot of heterogeneity there. We're not saying just take the institutions of the West, but what we're saying is that the coming together of the state and powerful family-owned business groups in Asia, which has been the singular feature of all these economies, of all, Vietnam just as much as India or Thailand. This framework will not necessarily be supportive of innovation, and for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it stifles competition. Too much of the markets are controlled by too few players. And let me give you one very stark example, which comes from India. It's very interesting. The 15 largest, and they're almost all, by the way, family-owned business groups. So here we have Tatas, we have Birla, we have the Ambanis, we now have Mr. Adani in there. The 15 largest of these business groups, non-public sector, non-financial, controlled, their revenues amounted to roughly 9% of India's GDP in 2000. Right now, it's about 15 or 16%. That's an extraordinary rise. So in other words, these large companies are controlling an increasingly larger bit of economic territory. And that is true almost in the region. Throughout the region. It's as true in Thailand as it is in Malaysia and the like. And what happens when you have that sort of ability to control territory, some of which comes because of excellent political connections. So Mr. Adani and his group is the most recent striking example. But that goes for Ambani as well and others. What happens? Well, some of them sit on their laurels and they don't innovate, they just take rents. Some of them innovate, and actually innovate a lot. And some who are not business groups also innovate, like Raphael and I were talking earlier, Infosys and the tech and the pharma companies and the like. So you do get innovation, but it's from a very narrow group of companies and interests. And it does not create the overarching and rich ecology that will, I think, support innovation in the long run. And I don't want to go on for very long, I'll hand it back to you, but let me give you the example of perhaps the most successful economy that we cover in the book, which is South Korea. Now, South Korea is an extraordinary success. I mean, essentially, it's got some very powerful, very successful, internationally competitive companies, of which Samsung is probably the best known. Now, Samsung accounts for roughly 22% of South Korean GDP. It's very innovative, it's very dynamic. But the reality is in South Korea, and this is the preoccupation of policymakers there, there's not much that goes on outside of it. It's like a large banyan tree under which virtually nothing else thrives. So yes, innovative. And in that case, more so than elsewhere in Asia, precisely because it's so open to competition. But a lot of risk rolled up. So if you are in Korea's policymakers' shoes, they worry that so much risk is concentrated in so few players. So if they get the wrong bets, the implications for the economy are very large. So to cut to the quick, I feel that Asia will innovate, but it may not necessarily innovate to the extent that is feasible or desirable, and therefore it will underachieve. Whether it will underachieve relative to Latin America and Africa, it's clear that it will overachieve, but the barrier is not set very high, to be fair. In that instance, I see it. So really our book is about why we might want, or people interested in policy, to rethink this reliance on large, politically connected, family-run business groups. They have a place, but they shouldn't have the place that they have right now. And the consequences will be, I think, that Asia will underperform. And the last point that I want to make, which is really a very, very important one, and particularly in political economy terms, which is that these business groups have seen the most extraordinary concentration of wealth, and indeed of income. Really extraordinary. The number of billionaires in China has gone from almost nothing in 2000 to in the hundreds. Similarly in India, a few in 2000. Some of the individual wealths are quite extraordinary. The Chiaravanont family, Chinese Thai family, probably the owners of CP Group in Thailand, their consolidated wealth is north of $24–25 billion. And I really don't find, from looking at a long perspective, whether it's in Europe or in Latin America or in other countries, that you can get broad-based prosperity in the long run when you have these degrees of inequality. And I think this is, sad to say, one consequence of the system. So I don't know whether that's a good response to your points, but it is.
I think that in a sense, what is happening also is that maybe we try to judge the Asian institutions from the Western mentality. And I'm not sure how fair is that. For example, you mentioned industrial policy. Well, industrial policy maybe is, actually I think that at least the US and the European Union, there is a revision of the non-industrial policy paradigm of Gary Becker and so on. No? But I think that for them, industrial policy is fine and is not hurting. That doesn't hurt the productivity or the growth model. No? Now the question is, how can we reconcile the fact that these groups, family groups, business groups, with the political ties, with the fact that, for example, China is the #1 exporter in the world. Because if you are exporter, it means that you are competitive and you are productive. No? Well, I can also talk about Korea, South Korea, and other countries. No? But these countries are exporting a lot. And that it's even more than the US, for example. No? So I think it's hard to reconcile this claim that they are not that productive or competitive, and that they are maybe too big in terms of the economic size, with this extraordinary performance of exports. So we are not only talking about GDP, we're talking about exports, the role in world trade, which is fantastic. You know? And now I agree with you that we have a problem of inequality, but not only in Asia. We have a problem of inequality everywhere, and in particular in the US, wealth concentration is, I would like to see a ranking on that, is as high as, or even higher than the cases you mentioned in Asia. No? And finally, technology. I read this report of our colleagues, the think tank Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, that says that they measure 44 technologies, And in 37 of these 44, China is ahead of the US. Meaning the technological progress. No? You mentioned in the book that you don't like the way they measure patents, because the patents in Asia are not, in a sense, equivalent to the patents in the Western world. I would like maybe a word from you on that, because patents are patents, no matter how we measure them. No? And there are some, of course, some technologies like artificial intelligence, where clearly the Asian companies, particularly the Chinese companies, are well ahead of even the US. So I'm not sure that this asymptote, because your claim is that there is going to be an asymptote in the growth, no, of these countries, and maybe we are reaching this asymptote. I don't see any sign of asymptote, and I'm not convinced, even if I find your book very, very interesting and very provocative, any sign that we are getting close to that asymptote.
Okay. Well, let me come back at you on a couple of points. Firstly, the governance point. I mean, the book, it must be clear, we're not saying, oh, just adopt what's in the UK or the US. It really is definitely not that. And you're absolutely right. Many of the points are relevant to the US, where, for instance, in the title of the book, connections between politicians and business are far too close, far too cozy, and far too opaque in many cases. I mean, the ingenuity with which business has gone about making political contributions in the US is impressive, but not in a good way necessarily. So we're not saying that, but we are saying that, if you're a minority shareholder in a family-owned business in India or in Thailand or in Indonesia, you will probably come out at the wrong end of the bargain. And this is very, very clear. I mean, these structures are organized like pyramids in order to benefit the families who own them and to give them far more control than their ownership ought to confer. And they use it sometimes for good purposes and sometimes, as I would suggest, is being alleged for Adani, for purposes that are thoroughly undesirable, not least of all huge leveraging, debt, offshore games, all of this. So I think, when we're talking about better governance, there's a sort of almost a moral dimension to it, just as much as a political one. So on that, but I really don't want to come back that we're not saying go and just adopt, London's corporate governance code, not a bit of it. Now, by the way, it is true, of course, you mentioned Hearst and Ford and the like, but actually Roosevelt, of course, did enormous amounts of effort in the 30s to unbundle and basically dismantle the business group as a format in the US. And the conglomerates still exist, but by and large, American companies are not operating in tens of sectors, in huge numbers of activities. They really aren't. I mean, just to give you, I gave you some information about India, all of those groups. Let me tell you that most of those groups, believe it or not, have, tens, if not hundreds of subsidiaries and operate in upwards of 40, 50, 5-digit industries. They're in everything. They're highly diversified. And that's really weird because in Asia, just as much as in the US, actually their value on the stock exchange is normally depreciated when you do all of these sorts of things. But they're doing it, and they're doing it for a reason, because they derive benefits. And many of those benefits are to do with cross-finance within the group, but also connections to politics and the way they assemble their business empires. So that's on one. Trade, you're absolutely right. China, of course, has been in a sense, trying to upgrade its trade. There's a lot of low-end stuff that they've been exporting, now they're wanting to move into high-end. But where we think, and this joins up with technology, that China is particularly innovative, and these are essentially bringing together financial and other services, internet-based services together with products that are, I mean, much more integrated, probably much more effective than their Western comparators. But these are for the domestic market, and they proceed behind protection, enormous amounts of protection, intellectual as well as trade protection. And lastly, on technology, you quote the Australian study. That study I thought was really weird, and it just tells you why one should be careful. They went about looking at citations and then came up with a normative list almost. So I don't really find the methodology convincing. And on patents, the point that we make in the book is a lot to do with China, because China is a patent machine. But the number of patents that are lodged and the number of patents that are granted, there's a massive disparity. And what it suggests is that many Chinese companies lodge patents because they will get credit in Beijing, because patenting is an explicit goal in the 5-year plan and the like. But actually very few of them get granted. And then when you go and you look at patents that are granted in China and also in a foreign jurisdiction, whether it be Frankfurt or in Washington or wherever, then the number falls dramatically lower. These are high-value patents, and they are with companies that you would expect them to be. So for Korea, it's largely Samsung and the like. But with China, the patent story has to be looked very carefully, and it's, I think, much more nuanced. So that's how I'd come back to you on those, Miguel.
Okay, I think we are going to end this part. I just to mention that, of course, I'm not claiming that institutions are irrelevant. I completely agree with you that institutions are very important, but I don't think that this difference in institutions is that relevant as to justify that Asia is going to go through an asymptote, or, as the economist said last week, a peak. I think that's something that to be discussed. You're not going to convince me. I'm not going to convince you. And the problem is that we have to take 50 more years to check who is right. But probably, I don't know about you, but probably I'm not going to be around. But you guys, the youngest people here, please check in 50 years to see who was right. In any case, it's really worth it to read this book and to debate on this book. And it has been a pleasure again to have this with you.
Thank you, Miguel. You're very nice. Actually, I'm going to come back on one thing. We don't say it will asymptote. We say that there is a significant risk that it will asymptote if certain changes aren't made. And so we're not deterministic in that way. And I just say that it's really, I mean, part of the reason for writing the book was we felt that a lot of the literature was perhaps almost naively optimistic, and that you should have a more critical eye on it. Anyhow, enough said. Thank you for your comments.
Pero yo creo que todos también queremos escuchar a esta otra invitada de excepción, otra apasionada de Asia y de la economía asiática, como es Águeda Parra. Como les decía al principio, en esta segunda parte vamos a relacionar el contenido del libro de Simon con temas que están de actualidad, y en concreto me gustaría poner sobre la mesa uno que ha acontecido este pasado fin de semana, y es ese acuerdo al que llegaron la presidenta de la Comisión Europea, Ursula von der Leyen, y el presidente de Estados Unidos, Joe Biden, en la cumbre del G7, en el que han anunciado además nuevas inversiones en la región Asia-Pacífico. En concreto, si no me fallan a mí mal las cifras, la Comisión Europea anunció préstamos por 4.000 millones de euros. El objetivo de este acuerdo, hacer frente o contrarrestar el One Belt, One Road impulsado por China en 2013. China impulsa un proyecto en 2013, nosotros estamos reaccionando 10 años después, en 2023. Y aunque es un tema que ya habéis apuntado durante ese debate, a mí me gustaría poner sobre la mesa y extender esa primera pregunta, la que da nombre al título, al presente evento, y es si Asia está sobrevalorada o es que el mundo occidental está reaccionando tarde, Estados Unidos y Europa están reaccionando tarde. Si os parece, le cedo la palabra a Águeda en primer lugar y luego ya continuáis vosotros.
Vale. Bueno, pues un placer estar aquí con vosotros, un placer escuchar el debate sobre el libro. Coincido con Beatriz en que estaríamos mucho más tiempo hablando sobre ello y muchísimas gracias por la invitación para estar hoy aquí con vosotros. A ver, yo creo que hay una cosa importante y además se ve, ¿no?, en la reunión del G7 en este fin de semana pasado, ¿no?, y es que Asia tiene un momentum específico que no tiene Occidente. De hecho, la capacidad de reunión de todo el G7 y los invitados que además Japón ha incorporado a Hiroshima ponen de manifiesto, ¿no?, el gran potencial que tiene Asia y el posicionamiento que quiere tener Japón en convertirse en otra vez una potencia en innovación, cogiendo, bueno, pues esas dinámicas, ¿no?, que se están generando de gran movimiento por parte de todas las tecnológicas japonesas y surcoreanas principalmente, en impulsar, ¿no?, el que esa transición digital y energética vaya más de la mano de estas grandes potencias en sus inversiones internacionales en otros países. El que se intente potenciar Asia-Pacífico es precisamente, ¿no?, por el tema de ese desafío que plantea China, ¿no?, esa inquietud por ralentizar el ritmo que ha alcanzado China en ese desarrollo tecnológico. Por lo tanto, lo que viene a significar, ¿no?, es que Asia ahora mismo tiene un momento de desarrollo tecnológico mucho más desarrollado que Occidente, y en ese sentido es donde, bueno, pues nosotros hemos tenido, ¿no?, este impasse también que ha tenido a nivel mundial, ¿no?, todo el efecto de la pandemia. Eso se ha sufrido de manera transversal, pero sí que es verdad que quizás en la cuestión de la guerra de Ucrania, ¿no?, Europa está un poco más estancada, ¿no?, en su posicionamiento en esa agenda estratégica, y por lo tanto la agenda estratégica del G7 ha estado mucho más enfocada, no como antes venía siendo, a los países occidentales, sino hacia la parte asiática para potenciarla.
Sí, vamos, yo creo que la primera sorpresa del G7 es que haya resucitado, porque yo recuerdo en la crisis de 2008 que se hablaba entonces de que el G7 había muerto, y creíamos que había muerto para siempre y que iba a ser sustituido por el G20, y de hecho fueron las grandes reuniones del G20, la famosa de Washington de 2008, donde surgieron los stimulus packages, ¿no?, los paquetes de estímulo fiscal, por ejemplo, el plan E en España, el plan ARRA en Estados Unidos, de Obama, etcétera, etcétera. Todo eso surgió en cumbres del G20, ¿no? Y la gran sorpresa es que haya renacido el G7, ¿no? Y creo que ha renacido por parte de la obsesión que tiene Estados Unidos con China y la dificultad que tiene Estados Unidos en aceptar algo que a mí me parece evidente, aunque probablemente Simon no esté de acuerdo, y es que China va a adelantar a Estados Unidos como la gran potencia mundial, y lo va a hacer pronto, a pesar de que el Economist diga que no y algunos digan que no, ¿no? En términos de PPP, paridad de poder de compra, ya lo ha adelantado, pero si miramos en términos de PIB relativo de China a Estados Unidos, tanto si lo medimos nominalmente como realmente, China es un 78% de la economía americana. Pero en los últimos 10 años, la media de cierre del gap ha sido de más de 2 puntos al año, incluyendo el COVID, etcétera, etcétera, el COVID cero, todo esto que iba a frenar tanto a China, el COVID cero, etcétera. Y por tanto, si estamos ahora mismo a 22 puntos, China me refiero, de Estados Unidos, y se cierra el gap 2 puntos y pico al año, no es disparatado decir que en 10 años se cerrará el gap y China adelantará a Estados Unidos. Esto es una píldora muy difícil de tragar para Estados Unidos, ¿no? Estados Unidos necesita hacer algo. China tiene un plan. Yo creo que todo el mundo lo ve y lo acepta, y no creo que sea malo que tenga un plan, ¿no? Un plan que está basado, por ejemplo, en el One Belt, One Road, que sin duda es la nueva ruta de la seda. Es un proyecto gigantesco, pero es un proyecto, en teoría, que es bueno para la globalización, es bueno para el medio ambiente y es bueno para el planeta, en teoría, ¿no? No sé exactamente el miedo que hay al One Belt, One Road, ¿no? En segundo, invertir en África, pero invertir en África es lo que tendría que estar haciendo la Unión Europea, por su proximidad y por el riesgo que supone África para Europa, por ser la única región del mundo donde va a haber un crecimiento exponencial de la población, ¿no? Y tercero, está invirtiendo en América Latina, algo que también tendría que estar haciendo Europa por las conexiones culturales e históricas entre América Latina y la Unión Europea. Entonces, que China tenga un plan y lo esté ejerciendo, a mí me parece positivo para esas regiones y para el mundo. ¿Cuál es el plan de Estados Unidos? Pues el plan de Estados Unidos son aranceles, proteccionismo. Yo no he visto otro plan, por lo menos en la era de Trump, y Biden le sigue un poco pues le sigue el rollo un poco a Trump en esto, ¿no? Proteccionismo, aranceles, barreras, etcétera, ¿no? Ahora, con el IRA, parece que hay una apuesta por inversión en Estados Unidos, pero claro, es utilizando para las energías renovables, ¿no? Que no me parece mal, y que quizás Europa también lo tendría que hacer, pero fíjate que está utilizando las herramientas que Simon critica en su libro. Herramientas de política industrial con fuerte financiación pública y basada en grandes empresas industriales, en este caso, o americanas o que inviertan en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Por tanto, me parece que si esa es la reacción americana al reto de China, está haciendo una reacción en el sentido de las cosas que critica Simon en su libro.
Okay. Can I come in? Yeah, okay. So apologies for continuing in English, but if I inflicted my Spanish on you, you'd be groaning, I think. Look, the points you made, I think there's no doubt, as Miguel has said, that there is a lot of innovation going on, particularly in China. Put aside Korea for the moment. The question is, I mean, so much of this is now distorted by the very unpleasant and dysfunctional rivalry between the Americans and China, and the nature of that debate and the instruments that are used. And much of it, I think, we would all agree is probably neither intelligent nor desirable. Certainly on the American side and to some extent. Now, the question is, what's China innovating in? Well, we can find plenty of good examples: electric vehicles, renewables, solar, less so, but certainly. And they seem, at least with electric vehicles, to manage to make a jump in innovation, which they never made with the old-fashioned combustion engine. They have manufacturers, but they were never competitive. Now, we'll see whether those electric vehicles are competitive once the massive subsidies that they give them, including for exports, expire or at least get phased down. But the tension around technology and between the US and China in particular is really a lot about military and artificial intelligence. And the irony is that actually both sides are using, in slightly different ways, huge amounts of public resources to support activities in both those areas for their purposes. So much of the advances in AI in China are directed at facial recognition and other security-related derivatives of that. The military, we know, is. So actually, there's more in common there than there is, there's less in common. And it's just a shame that so much of it is being directed to military defense, which ultimately I think will be of much less benefit to their populations than other investments.
That's another debate.
That's another debate,
That's another,
but it's an
whether
important one.
spending in military defense is a waste of resources or not, is another debate.
Yes, okay.
Como dice Miguel, lo dejamos para otro debate de Gate Center, si os parece, ya vamos aportando ideas. Bien, Miguel, has apuntado a ese plan de China. Simon en su libro hace referencia a esas redes entre grandes grupos empresariales, entre gobiernos asiáticos, y curiosamente este fin de semana también se celebraba, paralelamente a la cumbre del G7, se celebraba una cumbre paralela presidida por Xi Jinping, a la que asistieron los principales mandatarios de las 5 antiguas repúblicas soviéticas. Y además, a mí me llamó mucho la atención que se celebró en la ciudad de Xi'an, que es el punto de partida de la ruta de la seda. Me gustaría saber vuestra opinión o vuestra valoración de ese movimiento que se ha dado, si entra dentro de esas redes, dentro de ese plan de China, si esto es un paso más hacia esa intención de China de liderar el comercio mundial, qué consecuencias o cómo puede afectar esto a nivel geopolítico, a la política internacional y a los países occidentales.
Porque creo que es una respuesta al G7 y es responder a algo que creo que es erróneo, que es la resurrección del G7. Yo creo que hay que volver al G20, olvidémonos ya de G7 o del grupo digamos, asiático liderado por China, volvamos al G20. El G20 era el germen de la gobernanza mundial multilateral y creo que eso era un buen arranque y es una pena que eso se haya roto y sí que creo que Europa debería no haber acudido, no haber caído en la trampa esta de ser arrastrada por Estados Unidos al G7 y ya que haya ido Lula ya es para nota, ¿no? O incluso el primer ministro de la India, que no sé muy bien qué pintaban ninguno de los dos en una reunión de G7, que al final por el comunicado parecía más una reunión contra China que una reunión para abordar los principales problemas del mundo, ¿no? Entonces yo sí que creo que debemos recuperar el sentimiento de cooperación que de alguna forma está detrás de Gate Center, de diálogo y de cooperación y no de confrontación, en este caso entre China y Estados Unidos, porque creo que no le viene bien al planeta y desde luego no le viene bien a Europa. I know that you have decided not to be European, which I'm sad about it. But
I didn't decide that.
you guys. But
You can speak of others.
But I think that you should agree with me that for Europe, not European Union, for Europe, it will be wise not to be in the conflict between the US and China, and to try to be neutral and to cooperate with everybody, because I think it's in their own interest. But I would like to hear your opinion on that, and of course of Águeda.
Tu pregunta, ¿no? Yo creo que es algo muy simbólico, ¿no? Japón ha elegido Hiroshima como algo con tremendo simbolismo en el momento en el que ahora mismo se está, ¿no? Es enfatizar, ¿no?, la paz mundial. Y el hecho de que China haya elegido exactamente la misma semana para reunirse con los 5 países de Asia Central, además la misma semana en la que el enviado de China visita Ucrania, hace que China se posicione, ¿no?, en el tablero geopolítico global como un actor relevante del mismo nivel que el G7. Es decir, China lo que quiere venir a exponer, ¿no?, es que los temas globales no son solamente cuestión del G7, en donde él no está, sino que él es un actor relevante en este punto. En ese punto, además, entra en sintonía, ¿no?, las ambiciones que tiene China con los 9 puntos que el G7 le ha dedicado a China en exclusividad para tratar el desafío que supone China. Y es que si dos cosas han protagonizado lo que es la agenda del G7, pues es la agenda estratégica principalmente agenda económica, y la agenda económica es cómo va a afrontar Occidente su desarrollo tecnológico. Por lo tanto, la reunión de 2 días antes de empezar el G7, en donde 10 de las principales empresas tecnológicas del mundo se reunieron en Japón, pues dan un simbolismo, ¿no?, de hacia dónde va la reunión del G7, que era apenas un día después. Y el segundo punto más importante es el tema del Indo-Pacífico, ¿no? Decíais antes vosotros en el libro que ahora Asia empieza, ¿no?, en Oriente Medio, ¿no?, lo que para nosotros es Oriente Medio. Bueno, pues claro, es que el Indo-Pacífico, que es ahora como se viene a utilizar la terminología, pues claro, es el ámbito de interés desde India hasta todo lo que es el Pacífico, en donde no solamente es interés de China, sino es el interés global. Y de ahí vienen, ¿no?, un poco los invitados al evento, ¿no? India precisamente está invitada al G7 para intentar mitigar, ¿no?, que haya demasiada sintonía en determinadas cuestiones con India, aunque ya sabemos, ¿no?, que la sintonía económica y geopolítica de rivalidad no es esa, pero sí quizás a lo mejor en el campo financiero, en donde se está haciendo demasiado énfasis en reducir la hegemonía del dólar a expensas de impulsar el protagonismo del renminbi en los mercados internacionales. Y precisamente ahí viene un poco el ámbito de Brasil, en el que el yuan yo creo que es el principal problema ahora mismo. No es una cuestión de que ahora suponga una gran amenaza, el dólar sigue dominando el 84% de las transacciones internacionales, pero por ejemplo, de los acuerdos que se han hecho en Asia Central, pues hay otro país más que directamente ya también va a hacer las relaciones comerciales con China en yuanes. Por lo tanto, de cada vez más, ¿no?, ese posicionamiento de China en todo lo que es el ámbito regional suyo, no solamente lo está focalizando, ¿no?, en mejorar y potenciar sus relaciones bilaterales, sino además en este impulso de su hegemonía, que no solamente va a ser a través de un impulso comercial, sino además un impulso en esa afín que va a llevar el que los países utilicen el yuan como su medio de transacciones internacionales en lugar del dólar, con lo que ello conlleva, ¿no? Al final el dólar no es el dólar el que pierde el protagonismo, sino que es Estados Unidos el que va perdiendo ese protagonismo regional y global.
Con confrontación también financiera y monetaria. Simon.
Well, just very briefly, I mean, I thought what you said was, I agree with. On Miguel's question, I'm sure it's right if Europe tries to keep an independent position, but I'm not that positive that it will happen, not because of differences within Europe, but because thinking back to the last Cold War, it was very hard to stay on the fence. And you even see this within Asia. So I want to make a point. We're talking about China and the US. So what do we have there? We have, on the one hand, a power that is worried about its hegemony, to put it crudely. On the other hand, we have a power in whose hands increasingly are concentrated in one person and the apparatus around him, who has, in inverted commas, a historic grievance and some not small degree of hubris. So when you have these two entities that are, in a sense, trying to go off against each other, it's very hard to find a space in the middle where civility, decency, common sense, all of these other aspects, and self-interest can work out. And I would just say a measure of how difficult that is the divisions within Asia. So where do we find India and China? Well, if you look right now, they're both ambiguous. Well, one is on the side of Russia, sadly. The other is playing a game largely because it wants cheap oil, but nevertheless is ambiguous. But actually, India and China have nearly come to war in the last couple of years in the Himalayas. There's a standoff up there which could explode any time. There's huge tension. So India is joining with Australia, the UK, the Americans in a military pact. Southeast Asia, the Filipinos and the other states are all worried about Chinese expansionism and the like. So yes, I would like Europe to have an independent place, but I feel that the space for that independence is going to get squeezed really quickly if things go on as they are. And that's because of the nature of the two combatants, in inverted commas.
Nos quedan 2 minutos para las 7, no sé, Miguel, si tienes tiempo para contestar una pregunta más. Tenemos que hacerlo muy brevemente, como les he avanzado, Miguel tiene que salir corriendo a otro acto. Tenía muchas preguntas, pero voy a tener que elegir, o muchas cuestiones que plantear sobre la mesa, pero voy a centrarme en alguna que ya habéis apuntado durante el debate. La primera es esa destrucción creativa de la que habla Simon en su libro, que a mí me llamó mucho la atención el dato de que en China solo se otorga 1/3 de las patentes solicitadas, mientras que en Estados Unidos es un 60%. No sé si ahí también habría que ver cuáles son esas patentes y qué calidad tienen esas patentes. Y las segundas, formulo las dos en una por los tiempos. Yo creo que cuando hablamos de Asia tenemos que hacer referencia obligatoria, y la habéis hecho ya, a África y a Latinoamérica, esas relaciones que se producen entre Asia, en concreto, más concretamente China, con África y Latinoamérica, y el posicionamiento de China en el continente africano, algo que además ya hablamos en un debate previo también aquí en Gate Center. Miguel, Simon, ¿quieres empezar tú?
Con respecto a las patentes, entiendo que puede haber un debate sobre cómo medir las patentes, si hay patentes de alta calidad, de baja calidad. A mí en el fondo me da igual ese debate, porque aquí lo relevante es exportar. Y estamos hablando que Estados Unidos todavía no ha sido adelantada por China. Está cerca, pero no ha sido adelantada, ¿no? Pero China tiene el 15% de las exportaciones mundiales y Estados Unidos, que está por encima de China, el 8%. Entonces serán muy malas las patentes en China, si no estará bien medido y no sé qué, pero que exportan el doble que Estados Unidos y nadie es obligado a comprar los productos chinos, y además productos tecnológicos, porque China ha pasado de copiar a innovar, ¿no? Por tanto, a mí el tema de las patentes, yo entiendo que lo defiende Simon y bueno, pues yo tengo otra visión, que creo que las patentes es solamente un síntoma, pero la verdad son las exportaciones. Las patentes es una herramienta o un instrumento más, ¿no? Y luego con el tema de la innovación. Claro, es que China está innovando no solamente en defensa, como decía Simon, y en el vehículo eléctrico, que ya me parece relevante, sino que está innovando en muchas más áreas, ¿no? Y el porcentaje de investigadores que tiene China con respecto al total de investigadores mundiales es altísimo. También está muy por encima de Estados Unidos y muy por encima de lo que se supone que es el peso de China en la economía mundial. Entonces yo creo que eso es algo que no deberíamos minusvalorar. Por eso yo sí que creo que tenemos que ir a un modelo de cooperación con China. Modelo de cooperación con China no es decir que China nos mande en todo lo que quiera. Porque claro, alguien me ha dicho muchas veces, ya, es que yo si tengo que elegir entre meterme en la cama, esto lo decimos muy en España, meterme en la cama con Estados Unidos o meterme en la cama con China, prefiero meterme en la cama con Estados Unidos. Pues yo a lo mejor sí, pero es que el problema es que no me gustaría meterme en la cama con ninguno. Pero es que no solamente estamos ya en la cama con uno, Estados Unidos, es que le llevamos el desayuno por las mañanas. Porque lo que ha hecho Europa ha sido llevarle el desayuno por las mañanas en el tema del G7.
Well, I entirely agree with the last sentiment. I mean, who wants to be in someone else's bed, particularly if they're large and ugly? I mean, to exaggerate. Yeah, no, the innovation thing, look, I mean, you're right, America is not a great exporter, but when you're large and rich and have a huge domestic economy, there's much less drive to export. So I don't entirely agree with that. I think also, as I said before, when you look at what China exports, an awful lot of it is low-end stuff. It's bulk stuff. Now, they're trying to raise that. It's absolutely true. A point that Beatrice raised about lack of sort of the death, the exit and entry of companies. I think this is an important feature, and I want to broaden the argument way beyond China. The thing about these business groups, or Communist Party business groups in China, is that failing companies don't fail. They tend to get support from other bits of the group. So there are inefficiencies that arise there. And that's made worse when you have a large state sector, a public sector, which is not allowed to fail either, which has been the case in India, much less so now, and certainly is the case in China. So these arrangements are not good for that, for the exit side. And the entry side, now here I grant you, I may be bringing assumptions from the West, so-called, but my feeling is that innovation really takes off when you have lots of churning. You have lots of companies come in, some fail, some go on, they can experiment. And the evidence, and by the way, the evidence is not very good because the data is lousy, but such as one can see, is that's not very true in most of these economies, even in India and even in China. And I think that's a failing. So the broad point I would make from the book onwards is that there is innovation for sure going on, no one's denying it, but there could be an awful lot more if there weren't such a wretched constellation of government and these large groups occupying so much territory.
That I agree 100%.
Okay.
If institutions,
so we're agreeing completely.
No, if institutions in Asia were better, Asia will be, I mean...
Yeah, that's the counterfactual.
Right, but that doesn't mean that if institutions are worse to the Western extent, means that Asia is going to get, is going to slow down or get flat or whatever, yeah, as the claim, not only yours, but I think it's a more general claim, is starting, like for example, the Economist last week is going to become more general that this is going to slow down, and we are reaching a peak in China and a peak in Asia. I don't see the peak at all.
La foto finish al final te puede decir ahora mismo quién está en primero, segundo, tercera posición, sino yo creo que es más rentable, ¿no?, para los intereses de todos mirar de qué posición viene cada uno. Si miramos la posición de China, evidentemente viene desde más atrás, por lo tanto el recorrido que ha hecho lo ha hecho en mucho menos tiempo y con el mismo esfuerzo, porque el esfuerzo le vamos a presuponer igual entre todos, ¿no?, los que están poniéndose en la innovación. China tiene 10 millones de doctorados al año y en el 2030 doblará el número de doctorados, de personas que adquieren un doctorado en Estados Unidos. Por lo tanto, no solamente hay que mirar desde dónde viene, sino el potencial que están ganando. Ahora mismo es verdad, ¿no?, que, yendo al tema de las patentes, ¿no?, las patentes más renombradas, ¿no?, que son las que más se mencionan, evidentemente China está menos nombrada, pero lo que quiere decir es que si tú tienes un pool de talento que te está generando cada año un talento continuo, pues al final esto, pues el momentum que comentaba yo al principio, pues va a generar unos rendimientos que en Estados Unidos, incluso en la misma Europa, se está viendo, ¿no?, que la capacidad de generar estudio científico de cada vez es menor porque hay menos gente que se dedica a ello. Y el tema de la innovación es interesante verlo, yo creo, en el tema que habíamos sacado antes de los coches eléctricos, ¿no? Los coches eléctricos, China no llegó a esa primera revolución industrial, por lo tanto fue difícil, ¿no?, que fuera líder, ¿no?, en la combustión. Siempre se dice, ¿no?, como que China perdió ese tren. Pero es que en este tren va montado en alta velocidad, porque respecto de los otros países lleva ya 2 décadas invirtiendo en coche eléctrico, mientras que en los países occidentales estamos definiendo, ¿no?, qué modelo vamos a coger para la próxima década, y de hecho, ¿no?, pues ahora las empresas chinas son las que están marcando un poco, ¿no?, lo que son los ritmos. Por lo tanto, yo creo que en este ámbito, ¿sabes?, no es tanto la foto finis, sino de dónde se viene y qué capacidad tienes tanto de talento como de generar ese momentum tecnológico.
Para terminar ya muy rápidamente y empleando términos futbolísticos, minuto y resultado, en función de, en base a esta última respuesta que habéis dado, ¿veis posible ese sorpaso económico y tecnológico que pronostica Gates Center de China a Estados Unidos? Insisto, 3 palabras máximo.
Bueno, ya lo he dicho que sí, e incluso he puesto fecha, creo que en los próximos 10 o 11 años.
Simon.
Yes, but if there's a political revolution in China. If not, I think no chance.
This bet is 10 years. We will be around, so we can check on this one.
Águeda.
Yo creo que finalmente se terminará igualando. Yo creo que la etapa final va a ser más complicada. O sea, igual que hasta ahora lleva un ritmo de crecimiento que ha ido reduciendo ese gap respecto de las dos economías bastante rápido. Ahora yo creo que se va a ralentizar. Es difícil ahora pronosticar porque ahora estamos en una etapa de transición grandísima, no solamente geopolítica, sino también tecnológica. Por lo tanto, ahí va a depender mucho de las estrategias de cada país, pero que se va a dar, se va a dar. La cuestión es que la complejidad geopolítica que eso va a generar...
Pero voy a entrar otra vez en el debate, eso que me tengo que ir, pero ¿se va a ralentizar? ¿Por qué? ¿No? Bueno, un poco por los argumentos de Simon, pero la pregunta es, ¿se está ralentizando? Es decir, si tú coges los últimos 10 años, se ha ralentizado. Si tú coges los últimos 5 años, se ha ralentizado. Si tú coges desde el COVID, se ha ralentizado. Es que solamente el año del COVID, el año 2020, China fue el único país del mundo que creció. Y ahí le ha sacado 8 puntos a Estados Unidos, 8 puntos. Porque te recuerdo que Estados Unidos cayó un 5, un 10, y entre 5 y 10, depende de cómo lo midas, y China creció un 3. Por lo tanto, claro, se va a ralentizar, pero ¿cuándo y por qué? Porque digo yo que para ralentizarse tendremos que pasar de un gap de crecimiento de 2 puntos a uno de 1 punto o a uno de medio, y ahí veremos que se está ralentizando, pero es que el gap no se estrecha.
Pues yo creo que con Simon.
Yeah, but I think when you say that, Miguel, you've got to also ask where's that growth coming from. And I think if you disinter it, you'll find that some of it is coming from net exports, correct? But the biggest part of it is actually coming from investment. And that, I think, I was talking with Raphael before, as Michael Pettis, a Beijing-based economist, has rightly pointed out, that's a model that really is running out of steam. It's just creating enormous amounts of debt and leverage and holding down the living standards of the population, as in a classic Soviet maneuver. They basically transfer the savings of the poor Chinese people to fund these projects, building projects, other things. So I don't think we should be so content with that. Also, I mean, there's another point. I mean, Chinese GDP numbers are not necessarily the most robust. I mean,
that's the last resort.
No, but it is a resort, and it's not a fanciful point, Miguel. It's one that I've added to my other points. I'm not riding one horse alone.
Bueno, yo creo que con estas últimas respuestas, con esta última pregunta que decía yo en minuto y resultado, hemos plantado la semilla para otro debate que podíamos organizar también bajo Gates Center y en el que esperamos podamos alargar un poquito más, porque yo creo que ha sido muy interesante todo lo que se ha hablado aquí hoy, que se han quedado muchas cuestiones en el tintero, y agradeceros vuestra presencia aquí, Miguel, Simon, Águeda. Ha sido un placer compartir espacio con vosotros y nos vemos en la próxima. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.